ties with Africa, both economically and politically. However, the decision to withdraw their presence from the continent has become a perplexing dilemma. Looking at the recent happening in the Republic of Niger and other African countries, where France, for instance, has refused to leave the country despite being asked to do so by the locals, one would ask, why are the Western nations finding it difficult to let Africans and African...
Major developing news coming from Europe. The Secretary General of the European Union has announced that the EU has lost access to much of West Africa, specifically Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. He warned that this development will cause serious problems for Europe as the region has been a vital source of minerals and raw materials. In recent years, many West African nations have distanced themselves from European influence, forcing the EU to reconsider its strategy toward the region. The Secretary General emphasized that Europe must now find a new approach to rebuild relations with these countries.
If you look at Europe, Europe cannot survive without Africa. One situation that people don't realize, post-World War, when the US came up with the Marshall Plan, what they don't tell you is that the contribution through exploitation of African minerals was actually the biggest funder of the European Recovery Plan, ERP, aka the Marshall.
And Uganda now is exporting gold of 3 billion or something like that, dollars, from very low figure. Why? Because I banned the export of unprocessed gold. I said any gold which is not processed should not be exported. I banned the export of unprocessed minerals, including tin and all the other minerals, and copper. And because of that, investors were forced to come here because they cannot take our raw materials free from here.
Europe's modern economy rests on a foundation that is often discussed in terms of technology, finance, and regulation, but far less frequently in terms of raw material dependency. Beneath the sophistication of advanced manufacturing, renewable energy systems, transportation networks, and digital infrastructure lies a basic truth. Europe does not possess enough critical minerals to sustain its own industrial system. For decades, this gap has been filled largely by Africa. As African nations increasingly assert control over their mineral wealth, Europe is confronting a structural vulnerability that challenges its economic survival in ways few policymakers openly acknowledge. The minerals Europe lacks are not marginal inputs. They are essential to nearly every sector considered strategic. Copper powers electrical grids and electric vehicles, cobalt, lithium, manganese, and nickel arc or two battery storage. Bauxite underpins aluminum production, vital for construction, aerospace, and transportation. Phosphates are central to fertilizer production and food security. Rare earth elements enable wind turbines, precision electronics, defense systems, and medical technology. Africa holds a dominant share of global reserves for many of these materials, while Europe holds comparatively little. This imbalance has shaped Europe's external relationships for generations. Industrial expansion, energy security, and economic growth were made possible through predictable access to African resources. These supply chains were built over decades, optimized for efficiency and cost rather than resilience. As long as access was stable, dependency remained invisible. It becomes visible only when conditions change. Those conditions are now changing. Across Africa, governments are reassessing how mineral wealth is extracted, processed, and exported. The shift is driven by domestic pressures to create jobs, retain value locally, and escape cycles of raw material dependency. Export bans on unprocessed minerals, higher royalties, local content rules, and renegotiated contracts are becoming more common. These policies are not directed at Europe specifically, but Europe is among the most exposed. Europe's industrial vulnerability is compounded by its energy transition. The move away from fossil fuels toward renewables and electrification has sharply increased demand for critical minerals. Electric vehicles require several times more mineral input than combustion engines. Wind turbines depend on rare earth magnets. Solar panels require specialized metals. Energy storage systems rely on complex battery chemistries. The green transition, often framed as Europe's path to autonomy, has paradoxically deepened its reliance on external mineral suppliers, many of them African. Attempts to diversify supply have encountered limits. Europe can source minerals from other regions, but alternatives often come with higher costs, longer transport routes, environmental constraints, or geopolitical risks. Developing domestic mining projects faces strong public resistance, lengthy permitting processes, and regulatory hurdles. Recycling can offset some demand but cannot replace primary extraction at the scale required. These realities leave Europe with few options beyond continued reliance on Africa. Manufacturing illustrates how deeply this dependence runs. European automotive plants, aerospace facilities, electronics manufacturers, and chemical producers operate within tightly synchronized supply chains. A disruption in mineral supply reverberates quickly, slowing production lines, raising costs, and eroding competitiveness. Unlike service-based disruptions, material shortages cannot be solved with policy adjustments alone. They require physical inputs that must be mined, processed, and transported. Agriculture presents another often overlooked dimension. Europe depends heavily on imported phosphates for fertilizer production, a significant portion of which originates in Africa. Food security, crop yields, and agricultural pricing are directly linked to mineral access. When supply tightens or prices rise, the effects move quickly from farms to consumers. In an era of climate stress and population pressure, this dependency becomes a strategic concern rather than a technical one. Defense and security industries face similar exposure. Advanced weapons systems, surveillance technology, and communications equipment rely on specialized metals and alloys. Europe's ambition to strengthen strategic autonomy in defense cannot be separated from mineral supply security. Without reliable access to these materials, industrial capacity becomes theoretical rather than operational. The economic consequences of constrained access are cumulative. Higher input costs reduce profit margins. Reduced competitiveness leads to lost export markets. Factory slowdowns affect employment. Public finances come under strain as governments attempt to support industries facing external shocks. Over time, these pressures weaken growth and limit investment capacity. The risk is not sudden collapse but gradual erosion. Africa's changing posture highlights a broader shift in global power. Dynamics, resource-holding regions are increasingly aware of their leverage in a world defined by material scarcity and technological demand. African governments are acting within a global context where minerals are strategic assets rather than commodities. Their decisions reflect rational economic planning, not ideological confrontation. Europe's response has been uneven. Policy documents emphasize strategic partnerships and mutual benefit, but implementation often lags behind rhetoric. Structural reform is difficult in a system optimized for stability rather than adaptability. Meanwhile, competition for African minerals is intensifying as other global actors pursue long-term agreements, infrastructure investments, and processing partnerships. The challenge Europe faces is not merely securing supply, but redefining its role in a changing global economy, the era in which access to resources was assumed through historical relationships is ending. What replaces it will determine whether Europe can sustain its industrial base. Adaptation requires acknowledging dependency rather than obscuring it. It requires investment in processing capacity within Africa rather than resisting it. It demands a shift from extractive relationships toward shared value creation. Most importantly, it requires strategic patience, as rebuilding supply chains and trust takes time. The idea that Europe can fully detach from Africa's mineral systems is unrealistic. The scale of Africa's reserves, combined with the accelerating demand driven by technological and environmental goals, ensures continued interdependence. The question is not whether Europe will rely on Africa, but under what terms. Africa's mineral policies are reshaping global supply chains not through confrontation but through choice. Europe's survival as an industrial power depends on its ability to operate within that new reality. Failure to adapt would not mean disappearance, but decline, slower growth, diminished influence, and reduced strategic autonomy. In the end, Europe's dependence on Africa's minerals is not a weakness to be hidden but a reality to be managed. The future belongs to those who recognize structural change early and respond with flexibility. Africa is asserting its place in the global economy. Europe's response to that assertion will define its economic trajectory for decades to come. Europe's reliance on African minerals also exposes a deeper issue that goes beyond supply chains, the mismatch between ambition and material reality. European policy frameworks often emphasize technological leadership, green transformation, and strategic autonomy, yet these goals are materially impossible without sustained access to external mineral sources. Africa sits at the center of this contradiction. The continent holds the resources Europe needs to meet its own climate, industrial, and security objectives, while Europe lacks sufficient leverage to dictate the terms of access as it once did. This tension is increasingly visible in Europe's green transition, electrification, renewable energy expansion, and digital infrastructure are mineral-intensive by design. Each electric vehicle battery, wind turbine, solar array, and data center requires a complex combination of metals that cannot be substituted easily or cheaply. As demand accelerates, competition for these inputs intensifies. Europe is competing not only with other industrial economies but also with emerging producers seeking to process and consume more of their own resources domestically. Africa's move toward local beneficiation is particularly consequential. Processing minerals domestically transforms them from low-value exports into high-value industrial inputs. For Europe, this means that even when access is maintained, prices rise and supply chains lengthen. The cost advantage that once underpinned European manufacturing erodes. Industries built on just-in-time delivery and tight margins find themselves vulnerable to delays, renegotiations, and volatility. The political implications of this vulnerability are growing harder to ignore. Industrial disruption translates into social pressure. Regions dependent on manufacturing feel the effects first as production slows or relocates. Governments face difficult trade-offs between supporting affected industries, investing in alternative supply strategies, and maintaining fiscal discipline. Public debate often frames these challenges as failures of domestic policy, yet their origins lie in global structural shifts that cannot be legislated away. Europe's regulatory environment adds complexity. Environmental standards, labor protections, and community consultation processes are central to European values, but they also constrain rapid domestic mineral development. Attempts to accelerate mining within Europe frequently encounter resistance, legal challenges, and long approval timelines. While these constraints reflect democratic choice, they limit Europe's ability to substitute African supply with internal production at scale. Recycling and circular economy strategies are often presented as solutions, and they are essential components of long-term resilience. However, recycling alone cannot meet rising demand, particularly during the early phases of technological transition when installed infrastructure is expanding rapidly. Secondary supply supplements primary extraction. It does not replace it. This reality reinforces Africa's centrality in the global mineral system. Europe's bargaining position is further complicated by Africa's expanding network of economic partners. As infrastructure improves and regional trade integration deepens, African producers gain flexibility. They are less dependent on any single buyer or market. This diversification reduces vulnerability to external pressure and increases negotiating power. Europe, by contrast, faces limited alternatives of comparable scale and reliability. The notion of survival in this context should not be misunderstood as imminent collapse. Europe is not at risk of sudden economic failure. The risk is gradual decline in competitiveness, influence, and industrial capacity if adaptation lags behind structural change. Economic systems rarely fail dramatically. They weaken incrementally, losing ground year by year until recovery becomes difficult. The response required is not confrontation but realism. Europe must recognize Africa not as a peripheral supplier but as a central actor in the global economy. This recognition must translate into policy choices that prioritize long-term partnership over short-term advantage. Investments in African processing capacity, skills development, and infrastructure are not acts of concession. They are strategic necessities in a world where value chains are being reconfigured. Equally important is internal adjustment. Europe must reassess which industries it seeks to protect, which it can realistically sustain, and which require transformation. Strategic autonomy does not mean self-sufficiency. It means managing dependence intelligently. That includes stockpiling critical materials, diversifying sourcing where possible, and aligning industrial strategy with material constraints. Africa's mineral policies are part of a broader global trend toward resource nationalism and value retention. Similar dynamics are visible in other resource-rich regions. What makes Africa distinctive is the scale of its reserves combined with its developmental trajectory. As African economies industrialize, they will consume more of their own resources, reducing export availability regardless of external demand. This structural shift is irreversible. Europe's future role in the global economy will depend on its ability to operate within this new equilibrium. Influence will come not from historical ties but from competitiveness, credibility, and mutual benefit. The transition will be uneven and at times uncomfortable, but delay carries greater risk than adaptation. In conclusion, Europe cannot sustain its current industrial model without African minerals because that model was built on assumptions of stable, low-cost access to external resources. Those assumptions are no longer guaranteed. Africa's assertion of economic sovereignty is not a threat to Europe. It is a reality check. It reveals the material foundations upon which Europe's prosperity rests. The choice facing Europe is not between dependence and independence, but between unmanaged vulnerability and strategic adjustment. Acknowledging interdependence, investing in resilient partnerships, and aligning ambition with material reality offer a path forward. Ignoring these realities invites stagnation. Africa's role in the global economy is expanding, not retreating. Europe's response to that expansion will determine whether it remains a leading industrial force or becomes increasingly constrained by forces beyond its control. The era of assumed access is ending. The era of negotiated resilience has begun. Europe's dependence on African minerals is not a temporary imbalance or a negotiable inconvenience. It is a structural condition that underpins the continent's modern economy, from energy systems and transportation networks to agriculture, defense, and digital infrastructure. European industrial life is inseparable from material inputs that Africa supplies in abundance. As African nations assert greater control over how these resources are extracted, processed, and traded, Europe is being forced to confront the limits of an economic model built on assumptions that no longer hold. The central issue is not access alone, but timing and scale. Europe's green transition, industrial modernization, and strategic autonomy ambitions are accelerating demand for precisely the minerals that Africa controls. Electrification, renewable energy deployment, and battery storage are all mineral-intensive pathways. Without stable and affordable access to these inputs, Europe's transition risks becoming slower, more expensive, and less competitive. Africa's growing insistence on local value creation does not block Europe's access outright, but it changes the cost structure and bargaining dynamics in ways that expose long-standing vulnerabilities. What makes this moment critical is Africa's expanding leverage. Improved infrastructure, regional integration, and diversified global partnerships mean African producers are no longer dependent on any single market. As a result, Europe's ability to dictate terms has diminished. This shift does not reflect antagonism. It reflects normal economic behavior in a world where resource holders recognize the strategic value of their assets. Europe is now operating in a marketplace rather than a hierarchy. The risk for Europe lies in misinterpreting this shift. Viewing Africa's policies as obstructionist or destabilizing leads to defensive strategies that fail to address underlying dependency. The reality is that Africa's approach aligns with broader global trends toward resource sovereignty and domestic industrialization. Europe cannot reverse this trend. It can only adapt to it. Adaptation requires more than diplomatic language. It demands a recalibration of industrial policy to account for material constraints. Supply chain resilience must take precedence over short-term efficiency. Strategic stockpiling, diversified sourcing, and investment in recycling are necessary but insufficient on their own. Europe must also accept that meaningful partnerships will increasingly involve supporting processing and manufacturing capacity within Africa, even when this challenges existing business models. At the same time, Europe must confront its internal limitations. Domestic mining faces regulatory, environmental, and social barriers that restrict scalability. Recycling cannot meet rapidly growing demand in the near term. These realities make external dependence unavoidable. Strategic autonomy, therefore, cannot mean isolation. It must mean managing dependence transparently and intelligently. Africa's role in Europe's future is not optional. It is foundational. The minerals that power Europe's ambitions will continue to come largely from African soil. The question is whether Europe engages with that reality proactively or reacts to it under pressure. Proactive engagement offers stability, predictability, and shared growth. Reactive adjustment invites volatility, higher costs, and reduced influence. In the broader context, this moment signals a shift in global economic power. Resource-rich regions are asserting agency in ways that reshape value chains and industrial hierarchies. Europe's experience is not unique, but it is instructive. Prosperity in a multipolar world depends less on legacy advantage and more on adaptability. In conclusion, Europe cannot sustain its industrial, energy, and technological trajectory without African minerals because those materials are embedded in every critical system it relies upon. Africa's evolving policies are not a threat to Europe's existence. They are a test of Europe's capacity to adapt to a world defined by competition, choice, and interdependence. The outcome will depend on whether Europe responds with strategic realism or clings to assumptions that no longer match global reality.